This is Cover Your Ears with Brian Geller. Unlocking the secrets of the music industry.
The numbers all go to 11.
You're about to get the inside scoop from the industry insiders.
You go with the Van Halen tickets.
You never know what you're going to hear on Cover Your Ears.
Now raise your goblet of rock.
Hey, what's happening, everybody? Welcome to another week of Cover Your Ears. As always, I'm coming to you from Ultimate Ears Studio in Irvine, California, and I'm your host, Brian Geller. I want to say thank you for all the support, and please keep the downloads and streams coming. And if you have not done so yet, please leave a review. I want to say thanks to Greg McVeigh and the team over at Halen Sound. When I came up with the idea for Cover Your Ears, Greg was all in. So if you're into podcasting and looking for the best sounding microphones, look no further than Halen microphones, more specifically, the PR40s. Halen is celebrating 50 years this year and can be found at www.halensound.com. This week's episode is one I've been excited about for quite some time. In fact, I've been tempted for weeks to put this episode up, but I've held my ground and decided to release this in the running order I've been conducting interviews. I talked to my guest, rock author Greg Renoff, at the end of September. And to be honest with you, when I decided to do a podcast, Greg was on my original short list of potential guests. Why? The guy wrote the best biography on Van Halen that's ever been written, period. It's called Van Halen Rising, and take it from me, no other biography on Van Halen comes remotely close. We talked a lot of Van Halen, obviously, including a nugget or two that didn't make the book. How a guy that has a PhD in history ends up a rock biographer, and the all-time best high school movie ever, Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Greg, thank you so much for coming by, man. I really appreciate it. And this is the one interview I've been really looking forward to.
Hey, Brian, thanks for having me down. It's been really a fun visit already with you.
So, what brings you to Southern California?
Well, I've got some friends who live in Altadena, and I'm spending some time with them. And I am in the process of doing some research on my next book, which I have not announced the subject of it yet. But as I've been saying to people, it's a Van Halen-related book, and I will be able to sort of spill the beans on that soon. So I was doing a little research, and then, wanted to come down and spend some time with you and down here in Irvine, and it's been fun so far.
Yeah, that's great. I loved your book. It came out a year ago. It's called Rising. We just talked about it before we got on the air, but I was on my honeymoon and was savoring this book. Had to wait a month before the honeymoon. And then once I was gone, out on the beach, really enjoyed it. You nailed it. I mean, it's all about Van Halen before the first album came out and a story that, was never told. I was skeptical because I felt like as a Van Halen fan and a Van Halen tribute band singer that I pretty much knew everything. And I'm sure you've heard that before. Were you confident that you could dig deep and learn all about what we all wanted to know?
Yeah, I think as time went on and I was starting to pile up, I had worked on it for a number of years on and off, like putting months of work in on it. And after I started to pile up more and more interviews and talk to the people who had hosted the backyard parties and there had been a short-lived keyboard player in Van Halen in 1973, and I interviewed him and some other people who were close to the band. And I was really starting to get sort of a better sense of all the stories that I think you as a fan and everyone else who grew up as a fan read in the interviews, the little snippets about things, the backyard parties, the wet t-shirt contest, the Starwood, Gene Simmons, Ted Templeman, all these things. And I started to put it all together. I wasn't overconfident, but I thought that there were going to be people who were going to say, well, I learned more about Van Halen than I knew. I didn't have to spend a whole chapter reading about how Eddie and Alex switched instruments or something like that, sort of the stories we had all heard over and over again. I was really pleased with the response. Obviously, it's something that kind of, for me, was incredibly rewarding because as a fan, that's what I wanted all along, was to be able to know about these things. And that's why I spent the time digging on my own, just to find out and put together the rise of Van Halen before they sort of come on the national radar screen. Because I was always left with wonder what those backyard parties were really like. Did the helicopters really come? And sort of as that all kind of came together. And I was hopeful like that people like you would at least go, oh, this was, I got some stuff out of it. I really didn't expect it.
So how does a guy from the East Coast with a PhD in history, correct, end up going down this avenue?
I was, we were talking about teaching before we started rolling tape here, and I was a college professor, and I had done a book unrelated to rock music and had gotten tenure at the university I taught at and had some time. And I was just sort of thinking I need to do something different in terms of writing than writing the type of books that I typically write for other academics. And I wanted to do something fun. And I sort of began to, I could write something on Van Halen. And I just started doing a little bit of digging. And one of the things I first came upon was a Facebook group about this club in Long Gone in Van Nuys, California called the Rock Corporation. It was a biker bar. And this Facebook group, wasn't many people in it, but the owner of the club and some of the patrons who were still, around and on Facebook were on it. And I had remembered that Roth had talked about this was the place where the White T-shirts contest was first done.
Right.
And so I talked to the owner. He gave me this interview, and we went through the whole story about how that they had gotten busted. I read about this in Van Halen Rising about how they had gotten busted. The Vice Squad came in, and Van Halen was performing. And so that was sort of the beginning. I was going to do something about, Van Halen as a club band for, I don't know, for a website, maybe for Van Halen News Desk or one of these other. It was just meant to be this small thing, and I just kept snowballing. I would talk to people, and the gentleman who owned the club said, "Oh, we should talk to these girls. They were in the contest." And actually, one of them, her name is Valerie, is a good friend of mine now, and she's was thrilled to tell me the story. I was like, for her, it was like a fun thing. She was like 16 years old, and they said, "Oh yeah, it was this crazy thing. We did this wet T-shirt contest, and Van Halen was there," and it just kept snowballing. And so.
And I imagine with social media, it must have been a little bit easier to find people. Yes.
That was really the key. I've not under any illusions that 25 years ago, this would have been incredibly difficult to do, because people would say, "Oh, you should talk to my friend Steve Jones, find Steve Jones." And, I'd search on Facebook and Steve Jones would be there, and you could get in contact with Steve Jones. And as I went down the road of doing more interviews and getting to know people, I began to build up a network of people who could vouch for me. Because, as you said, I'm from the East Coast. I'm not from Pasadena. Right. I was an unknown quantity. But as time went on, people say, "No, this guy's serious. He's going to do this." And I think once people who I interviewed began to understand that I was about trying to capture the vibe of the time, and I was wanting to basically place Van Halen into the Dazed and Confused milieu, which I always loved that movie so much. I was a little bit, so I'm about 5 years old when the setting of that movie. I was born in 1969. So I always remember as a kid kind of seeing that the cars and the older kids. I kind of remembered that, and sort of to know that Van Halen was coming together as a band during that time. I wanted to kind of capture the fun of it. And so for people, when they understood it wasn't just meant to be solely a tribute to Van Halen or my interest in the band itself, but also to kind of understand how all of these kids in Los Angeles got so into rock music, and how this band Van Halen and some other great bands, as that came out at the time or were coming up at the time, Quiet Riot and some of these other bands, were developing followings that would eventually provide them with the platform to go on and become famous.
What's neat about it for me is I'm 2 years older than you. So for me, I was too young to be into that scene. I was in 6th grade when Van Halen 1 came out, and know exactly where I was when I first heard Running with the Devil. So to go back and read interesting tidbits on things that I didn't know in an era that, I just kind of missed out on. I mean, it was a great read.
Even I grew up in Queens in New York until I was about 10. Then my parents split and we moved to New Jersey. My mom and the kids went to New Jersey. And but I can still remember things like Bay City Rollers coming out, the kids play, listening to Saturday Night. I can remember that. I remember going into, maybe I got dropped off at my babysitter's house at the time. My mom was going somewhere. She dropped me off, and there'd be the Kiss poster with those guys, the Spirit of 76 with Ace with the bandage on his head. I kind of, I remember that's part of the fabric of my childhood. And of course,
music visually back then was amazing, right?
Yeah. And so, I was able to sort of in my own mind kind of dredge that up too, and wanted to sort of, kind of recapture that. And I ended up getting in the book, there's a couple dozen pictures. None of them had been published before. And I remember getting really, really excited when
and that's when I knew it was for real, because there was a few pictures in there that, no one had ever seen.
Yeah. Oh yeah. There was a number that I really was excited to get, but there was one. It was the first iteration of Van Halen. It was Mark Stone, Eddie, and Alex playing at a high school dance. And this a woman on Facebook said, I have a couple of pictures, and she found them, and they were like little, those little old, like you would see in a photo album when we were kids, of those guys standing there, Alex behind the sparkle silver Ludwig drums, Ed with his Marshall stack, and Mark Stone standing there with his Lucite bass. And I thought, man, this is the real deal. This is like the stuff that, as a fan, got me super, super excited to sort of say, this is where it all started. I mean, these guys started with plaid shirts, jeans, and dirty sneakers playing high school dances to go up to the heights of Anaheim Stadium a few years later to blow away Black Sabbath and everything. That for me was the thing that was really, really interesting.
So did you start writing at an early age for pleasure like this? Obviously, we were all writing in school and so
on. I didn't really start writing until I went to college. I never really wrote anything like this before. That was the other thing. I mean, that was one of the things that was, for me, a challenge, was that I had not written a book that was supposed to be, you take to the beach and read. And that was hopefully be well-researched and well-written, but it was not meant to be this sort of work for other professors mostly to read. And so, my writing in terms of working on becoming a writer didn't really start till I went to college and to graduate school. And I never wrote for the school newspaper or anything like that. But I took it, as a challenge too for myself to sort of say, I can write this in a way that's going to engage people. I wanted people to want to know what happened next. And that was the trick too with the book, was that the end. You pick up a novel now. Right. It's like you have the anticipation. What's the big reveal? What's going to happen? Who's the killer in the novel? We all knew the story, and so that was for me. I really wanted to keep the reader engaged. And there was enough with the Van Halen story. There were enough ups and downs, as you know, as a fan along the way, that made it, I thought, something that hopefully could appeal to a wider base than just the hardcore Van Halen fan. And that's one of the nice compliments I'll get to. Sometimes people say, I'm not even that big of a Van Halen fan, but someone gave me your book and said, you should read it. And I was like, wow, this is really...
That's the ultimate compliment.
Yeah, right.
I mean, obviously I'm going to love it.
Right. But also you were the exact person who was going to be the hardest critic, who was going to know everything in terms of, you were up on Van Halen facts and you were going to like, this isn't right, or this is wrong.
I mean, there's a few Van Halen books out there that are just painful, and nothing against the David Lee Roth biography, but that's impossible to get through.
Yeah, that's. I think that was, as Dave would have said at the US Festival, that was written under the influence of heavy narcotics. There's no question about it.
Probably could have used an interpreter for that, So, I mean, well, what kind of connections? You come from a history background.
Yeah.
Do you find any connections between writing about music and history?
Yeah, for me, it was about trying to tell the history of the band. I mean, that's, it's the book falls in that category of rock biography. But for me as a historian, that's one of the things that was important for me, not just to sort of sketch it out where I was like, well, what happened here? There'd be like a 2-year gap and things. I really wanted to try to get landmark events that happened through the Van Halen history in the early days the best I could, to sort of tell the story the way a historian would tell it, which is to sort of let people know how we got from point A to point B to point C. That was always a thing that I always thought was troublesome, and not just Van Halen books, just some rock books in general. You sort of, you read and you're like, well, what just happened? There's this whole period of time that, because, they just basically the author might jump from the end of a tour to they go in the studio for the next Led Zeppelin record or something. I'm like, well, what happened for the 6 months in between? There's these gaps. And
have you read a lot of different rock biographies? What are some of your favorites?
Well, the one that I always go back to is one of my favorites is Hammer of the Gods, which, was interestingly enough trashed by Page and Plant. Both said it was, in so many words, they just said, don't believe what you read in the book. But I've said this to a number of people before. I said, if I'm trying to get, a fact check of Led Zeppelin history. I may not go to Hammer of the Gods for every single fact. I might look at a different book, but for me, it captures that vibe of the mystery about Led Zeppelin and the Riot House and the tours and the just how huge they'd become and how they could demand these huge advances from the promoters. And
it's just one of those bands that, we place them above everybody else. And we want to learn and find out as much as we can about them.
Another one of my favorites is Peter Fletcher's Moon, which came out probably about 8 or 10 years ago. But I really would recommend people pick that book up. It's on Keith Moon. And to sort of open that book up and I had this idea that, Moon was always this eccentric guy, but to really understand that he probably had some sort of untreated mental illness that was part of what, made Keith Moon, made him great as a drummer but also made all the things that he did, to kind of look at it a different way, to sort of say, he was actually, when he was doing drugs and drinking, he was probably trying to medicate his own he would have these manic phases where he would like do these crazy things. And so, for me, that kind of humanized Keith Moon, and also along the same lines tells that great story of the Who's rise and then how huge they got and how they struggled at the end with Moon as he was struggling with his own addictions. Right. And so, I'm a big rock biography fan. Hendrix, all that. I love, read them all.
A book I enjoyed was Don Felder's book.
Oh, I've not read that one.
Amazing book and interesting story about that. I had finished the book and maybe had been done with it about 3 months or so. And get a phone call here at Ultimate Ears, and it's Don Felder. Mm-hmm. Little starstruck on the phone, and he says, he was checking on an order and said he was Don Felder. And I said, so the Don Felder that wrote like one of the greatest, licks in the history of rock and roll, Hotel California? He's like, yeah, the one and only. I was like, wow, I'm not kidding you. I literally just finished your book about 3 months ago, and it's a good one. I'm a big Eagles fan, and to hear his side of the story was very telling, and everything that happened afterwards. And then Glenn Frey passes away this year. It's just awful, tough year for celebrity deaths.
Yeah, the other thing, as long as we're talking about rock biography too, is I have not read the Felder book, but one thing I was aware of right away was that whether or not I had access to the band, and I ended up only talking to Michael Anthony and interviewing him, I didn't want to make the book the Dirt Junior. People are, sort of, the one good thing that ended up happening, I think, at least for me, my perspective as rock biography in general, is that because I'm not sure everyone's gotten the memo about this, but because the Dirt was so over the top and so raw with the type of things that they spilled in the book, it's sort of like, what's the point? I always say when I'll read these rock biographies, and some of them are just, it's just the same old, the laundry list, the groupies, the drugs, and you sort of go through it. And, if it's that person's struggle, chemical problems or something to struggle with, I understand that. But sometimes it just seems like, we need more of this, put more of this in. And I'm sort of like, it's like trying to outdo the Godfather, or I'm going to outdo the Godfather. Well, you're probably not going to outdo the Godfather. So why not try to do a different type of movie? And so
some of those biographies are painful too. Yeah. Like Ace Frehley's book it just goes on and on. It's almost like they all follow the same recipe.
Yeah.
And that's what's refreshing about your book.
Yeah.
It's a completely different thing.
And it wouldn't have been appropriate for me anyway to try to have people tell me 40 years later some memory they have of X person from Van Halen doing X thing in X place. It would have been, it wasn't going to be that way anyway. And it was just, that was one thing that was nice too, because sometimes people would kind of say to me, you talk about how many drugs they did. And I said, well, it's kind of a given. We don't need to go into detail about that. And it's not really my place. If it's appropriate to the story, there were a couple instances where there were, might have come up in the book, but it was never going to be.
The story about Edward.
Yeah. And that was,
I had never heard that. That's one of those tidbits that was a nugget for me.
So the story is that Eddie at the Golden West Ballroom in 1976 ends up snorting what he thinks is cocaine and it's PCP, and he overdoses. And the good thing for me with that story, because I had heard that from a number of people, and I had access to an interview that was done with Rudy Lirin back in the 80s, and Rudy mentioned it. I mean, I knew it had happened. It was, it was not something that was just an imagination on somebody's part that had happened. But Eddie had talked about an interview in 1998. He had gone on the radio and basically said, this is what happened to me. I think Eddie was clean at the time, but he was talking about his own demons.
If he hadn't have brought it up, do you think you would have wrote about it?
I don't know. I mean, and that's the thing. I probably would have, but it definitely gave me pause. I mean, because it's something you want to do also in a way that's not meant to be, for me, again, my approach was I didn't want to feel like I'm just trying to exploit something. But the fact that he almost died, I mean, that was the thing that people who I interviewed who were there was a friend of mine, a woman named Janice, who was actually working at the Golden West Ballroom down in Norwalk when that happened with the promoter and saw it. I mean, she said it was terrifying. It wasn't like look at this person's partying too much. They're asleep on the floor. He was having a convulsion and was taken to the hospital. It's a very, very serious thing. And so to have that, for me as a fan, to think, that could have been it. That could have been the last. No one would ever heard. We never would have heard of Van Halen if that would have been the end of that. And so,
well, think about how different your life would be today, as well as mine.
I know. What would I do with my free time? I just wanted to be respectful of the band too, in a way that said, look, I'm a fan. I didn't want to, I hope, glorify everything they did. I tried to be honest, in my opinion, with some of the demo recordings they did, like the Gene Simmons demo. I'm not a huge fan of what, I enjoy listening to it, but I'm not a huge fan of the production and the performances on that. And so I didn't want it to just be a glowing tribute to everything Van Halen ever touched, but also I didn't want it to be this sort of effort.
Now back on, I'm going to interrupt you real quick just because you brought up Gene Simmons. Did you have an opportunity to speak to him?
I didn't bother to ask Gene for an interview, not because I wouldn't have loved to talk to Gene Simmons, but I also felt as if Gene has been someone, as you know, who has not been shy about talking about his experiences with Van Halen. So I had quite a large archive, my own magazines, stuff that's been published online, of Gene going through the Van Halen story.
Plenty.
And so, I didn't want to be the guy who called up Gene Simmons, who's a busy man, and want to do this interview for 20 minutes and have him say to me, I won't do the Gene Simmons voice, but you can imagine I've already answered that question before.
Well,
have you read the interview I did with X person? I didn't want to be that thing. So
he had actually hired the Atomic Punks to play LA Kiss arena football game a couple of years ago. We went down there, and I mean, it was cool for our band. We got to go play at the Honda Center. We actually got to play an arena. Now, nobody was there, but we still got to play an arena, and they had the Kiss fireworks behind us. And we did get the opportunity to speak with Gene Simmons briefly. And he says, I did discover that band. And I kind of laughed. And, like you just said, Greg, I wasn't a big fan of the I don't know if it's the quality of the demos. It just wasn't polished yet. Right. But it's interesting. I said to him, like, well, do you regret that didn't go any farther? And he wouldn't admit to it, but in other words, he felt like that was like one of the biggest mistakes he let go.
Oh, he didn't. Yeah, I have observed this many times in terms of the timeline. Gene basically steps away from Van Halen in November 76 because he's going on tour with on the Love Gun tour. Sure. In February of 1977, that's when Ted Templeman walks into the Starwood, sees Van Halen, gets Mo Austin and Russ Titelman, who was another one of the producers. I actually didn't know that Titelman was the third guy, but Titelman, who produced a number of soft rock stuff in the 70s, produced Little Feat and some other things. He worked for Warner Brothers, and they all went to Starwood, and Ted was savvy enough to bring Mo Austin as well, because Mo was the guy who had signed Jimi Hendrix after Monterey Pop to Warner Brothers, and also had the guy who brought the Kinks on to Warner Brothers. And so Ted knew that Mo got hard rock. And so I'm sure for Gene, getting back to Gene, I'm sure from Gene's perspective, kind of when he heard just like 4 months after Gene, or 3 months after Gene had been talking to Van Halen and had those guys engaged in working with Gene, that Gene walked away, and then Warner Brothers swoops in and takes them to the top of the charts.
Well, and it's interesting too, because you have the whole Angel aspect of the Van Halen story, and that was a band I loved back in the day, and I kind of always felt that the band Angel kind of missed their mark. It was almost like if they would have come out maybe 5 years later during the video age, right, with the look, and there was some tunes that were pretty good. I felt like they could have made it, but I felt they just missed it, and the whole story. You had that in the book, right?
About You Really Got Me.
Right.
Yeah. There's that quote from Ted Templeman that, someone must have tipped him off that, hey, aren't you cutting You Really Got Me for the Van Halen record that's going to come out in like a month? There's these guys here, Angel, they're cutting it in the studio. They're going to put a single out. And he called up Eddie and he said, did you play it for anyone? He's like, yeah, I played it for all my friends. He's like,
Karma got Angel.
Yeah,
right?
Karma did get them. But for Ted, I think Ted had about a half a heart attack at the moment, to sort of say, why did you do that?
Right.
They heard it. They heard how great it is. Like, oh, yeah, we'll do the same thing.
Amazing.
Interestingly enough, to another piece of this is that Rick Derringer had his band together around the time that Van Halen was working on their record, and they were doing You Really Got Me Too. And so I know that was another one of those things that sort of maybe I didn't talk about in the book, but that was Vinny Appice and Danny Johnson and Rick Derringer, this great little band, Derringer, those two albums that came out, and that they were doing that live, and it was on a live record. So
is that right?
And I think that's partially what ended up leading to the tension in 1978, which I didn't talk about in the book, but that Derringer does some shows with Van Halen, and there's like this bad blood,
right?
Like, oh, you're stealing my licks, and I think probably Rick Derringer was probably thinking you stole my song. I was doing, right. And of course, You Really Got Me. I mean, every bar band in the country was doing You Really Got Me at the time, but sort of this sense of this rivalry.
How different would the book have been if Eddie and Dave had talked to you?
I think it would have been one of two. Well, there's a number of different ways it might have been very different. I had questions that I thought only Eddie could answer. I really, really wanted to know from Eddie's perspective, for example, what was the darkest moment for him in terms of his hopes for the band making it? Like, when did he get to the moment before they made it and had been signed by Warner Brothers to sort of say, this is it. I mean, it's over. And I always assumed it was probably the Gene Simmons thing, because that was such a crushing blow to not get the record deal after you have Gene Simmons, the biggest rock star in America, can't get you a record deal. But
that was always. I'm going to interrupt you again. I'm sorry, but the dialogue that you had put together of the guys being picked up at the airport was amazing.
See, and that was thank you. Yeah, that was one of the things that, again, that was sort of my persistence in talking to people, and the guy who told me that story, his brother is good friends. I believe still good friends with Roth, and they're basically Dave used to hang out at their house, and they would do backyard parties and hang out, and sort of, that's who they called to pick them up at the airport. They said, come on down. And David Swantek, told me the story. He was like, they were riding back in the car, and the brothers are like, we've blown it, it's over. And Dave's like, it's not over till we say it's over. It's like,
wow.
Did the Germans, give up after Pearl Harbor or whatever, the line for, and sort of rally the troops. But that was, I think too, the other thing that I really didn't expect people to kind of latch onto, because I don't think I really realized it as much until people started telling me when they read the book, is that how Dave was the guy who kind of kept the motion going. That, Dave maybe didn't come up with the riffs. Dave wasn't coming up with the music. He was writing melodies. He was writing lyrics, but he was the promo guy. I had this, I don't know if I put this in the book, but you'll appreciate this story since you're getting ready to go on your cruise, is that I talked to Mark Kendall of Great White. Mark was a guy who had seen Van Halen in the backyards, and then was eventually trying to start his own band in 76. I think Dante Fox, or it was sort of the early incarnations, the beginnings of Dante Fox. And he told me that, again, he was probably like 18 at the time, and walked up to Dave at one of these bars, one of these 5-set beer bars, and at the bar, and he said, hey man, how do you guys get so many gigs? He's like, well, I just get on, did this whole rap. Like, I just get on the horn and I'm calling all these club owners and I just tell them we got the best guitar player in the world. Like, kind of like,
right.
And so like Mark Kendall kind of walked away knowing he probably couldn't pull it off, but sort of, gave you a preview to like Dave was the guy who was, pushing and doing, and all those guys are working, but he was the spokesperson and the guy who really knew how to work with people and get people excited
without a doubt.
Yeah, with Van Halen. So it's a great Mark Kendall kind of like walking up and going, okay.
Pre-Great White days.
Yes. That was one of the other things too about doing the research for the book, is that I really wanted to try to get guitar players, particularly who had seen Eddie early on, and so I ended up talking to George Lynch, who of course had played shows with Eddie. I talked to Tracy G of Dio, who was Dio's guitar player, Angry Machines era, and to Mark Kendall and some of these other guys who later came up. Rusty Anderson, now who plays with Paul McCartney, shared stages with Eddie with his band Eulogy. Tommy Gervin, who Eddie Money, he's Eddie Money guitar player. And so these guys, I wasn't looking for those guys just to pay tribute to Eddie, but I wanted their perspective on the band Van Halen and what they saw Eddie bringing to the table and how they saw the scene itself. And so that was one of the things that was important to me, to sort of have the people who had the sense about the music industry, who actually worked in the industry, to sort of be able to look back and like, what did you see in Van Halen? What were they doing? How were they making it? And so Mark Kendall with that great story about Dave just laying this rap on him. Listen, kid, this is what I do. That's basically what he was like. Wow. This is what I do, kid. Write it down. Here's what I do.
So what do your days consist of? Is it, I know you're doing some things for, is it ultimateclassicrock.com?
Yeah, and Guitar World magazine. Right now my days consist of taking care of my kids a lot of the time. I have 4-year-old twins at home, so that takes up a lot of time when they're not in school. But also,
boys or girls?
They're girls.
So wow.
So we are, my wife and I are deep in the thick of it. But for me, as I said, I'm working on this follow-up book that's going to be related to Van Halen, and I'm just trying to basically get all my ducks in a row so I can start writing it in earnest and really kind of get the book out as quickly as I can. It's going to be some time; it'll be at least a year before it comes out. But I want to follow up this book in a way that I hope will give a little twist on my own abilities as a writer, and also not necessarily just immediately push me to do another Van Halen book in the way that this one was. It's not that I don't want to do that. I wouldn't do in the future, but it's sort of, you just want it to be a little bit, challenge myself and do something maybe a little bit of a left turn.
Now, who else would you want to write about if you were to do another biography type of writing?
That's a really, really good question. I grew up a fan of 80s music. They always say that if you're able to pinpoint when you had your first beer or whatever music you're listening to, that's pretty much going to set your musical taste for life. So for me, I had this cassette in 1984 with Rat Out of the Cellar on one side and Van Halen 1984, tape the records onto the tape. And that was sort of my tape for that summer. I'm really a guy who's become increasingly interested in 70s music. I wouldn't, for example, 60s music. So for example, I can't necessarily say I would ever write a book about Jimi Hendrix, but I'm a big Jimi Hendrix fan. And there's been a lot of great books about Jimi Hendrix, but I'm always amazed at just how much great music he was able to put on this earth in basically a 3 to 4 year period, and to have that all come together. And also the other thing too, that's interesting is that for me as a guy who really enjoys looking at albums and how albums are made, I just think that, the approach that Ted Templeman took with making Van Halen, which was much more of we're going to rehearse and get it nailed down, and we're going to go in Sunset Sound and we're going to nail it down, put it down as quickly as we can on tape. Whereas Hendrix would camp out in the studio. It's a very, very different type of approach to making records. So I'm that's one of the things that sort of captures my attention about Hendrix. But if I probably was going to write another book about a band, it would probably be a 70s band.
Interesting. And you're probably like me, always looking for some sort of new music.
Yes.
And with kids myself, do I look for new music today, or do I go back to the 80s? Do I go back to the 70s and try to discover something that I missed out on the first time? Yeah. Is there any bands like recently that you missed the boat on originally that you've gone back and gone, wow, I like this?
Well, a lot of the bands that I missed the boat on totally when I was younger was from doing the research for the Van Halen book was, a band like Cactus, which was Carmen Appice's band.
Right. And
I didn't know the first thing about this band Cactus. And I had a couple of good friends I did interviews with, now good friends of mine who I did interviews with who had seen Van Halen early on. And they were kind of like, oh, you don't know who Cactus is? It's like, get the first Cactus record. And once I heard that, they were trying to build themselves as the American Led Zeppelin. And in my opinion, the songs weren't as good. But that said, they were a great hard rock blues band. And when I heard Parchment Farm, which is, I would urge everyone listening to this to go on YouTube or get it and listen to the song, I sort of realized that was the template for I'm the One. And so for me, a lot of that stuff for getting back into these bands like Grand Funk, right. I don't know, as a kid it's so funny because
we got everything in the 70s.
Yeah, because Grand Funk was so massive in the 70s. And then by the time I was a high school student, 84 to 87, when I was in high school, nobody was talking about it. And the only thing I knew about Grand Funk was Some Kind of Wonderful or something, or The Locomotion, and then sort of go back and realize that Eddie and Alex idolized Grand Funk. So for me, that's been kind of the fun thing from writing this book and just continuing to sort of dig deeper into 70s music to sort of go, oh yeah, this Grand Funk record's pretty great. I can kind of understand why these guys were into it, even if by the time I sort of came of age musically, it was not something that I was going to go pick up a Grand Funk record.
Right. For me, it was in the 70s. We had disco, we had the movie soundtracks, we had Grease, and we had Saturday Night Fever that we were listening to. You had, the startings of punk rock, but I was a hard rock kid, and then going into high school in the 80s, it was almost, for me in Southern California, it was like, well, if I want to meet girls, I probably should put my Rat t-shirt away, but I always made sure and still had my Van Halen shirts on.
So when did you enter high school?
I went into high school in 81.
Oh yeah. So that's and that's interesting too to me, because that almost exactly syncs up with Fast Times, right? The whole Fast Times. Oh, look, there's the girl across the room with the Pat Benatar haircut.
Are you the guy with the Van Halen tickets?
You got the Van Halen tickets. There you go.
Yeah, that was right at the beginning of high school for me. And I went to the Yes Festival, and, I didn't make it known because meeting chicks was way more important to me than telling people I just went and saw Van Halen again.
I'll tell you a quick story that Ted Templeman told me when I interviewed him for the book was that, he was friends with Cameron Crowe. Cameron Crowe had written for Rolling Stone, so Ted had gotten to know Cameron as a reporter, and so Cameron had gone undercover to go to the high school to write the novel, the book, which actually is, to buy a copy of that book, it's very expensive because Cameron only allowed one printing of that book to go out and has never reprinted it. But there's the book Fast Times at Ridgemont High.
How is did you read it?
I've never read it.
I've never either.
Because the copies are absurdly expensive. But Ted told me that Cameron called him up at Warner Brothers. It's like, Ted, this is Cameron. He told him what he was doing, and I was going to write this novel or this book about high school called Fast Times. And he said, I went into the bathroom in the high school, and someone had written in this big magic marker, Van Halen rules in the stall. It was like the biggest thing. He's like, it's amazing. The guy drew on the logo, and sort of for Ted, Ted said that was a big, like he sort of really, like he knew Van Halen was big, but sort of gave him like a sense like, wow, we've really, really gotten
interesting.
The kids, like the teenagers are really into this band. Like Cameron was like, it was unbelievable. It's like this mural in the stall, Van Halen rules.
Oh, when Van Halen was mentioned twice in Fast Times at Ridgemont High, I mean, I felt like I was in Van Halen. I was so excited. And funny story, my senior year, they actually filmed the sequel to Fast Times at Ridgemont High called The Wildlife at my high school. And we spent the whole year, because they were filming the whole year, and we spent every single day trying to get into the background scenes. And when the movie came out, we went and saw it. We checked it out, and we never made it into the final cuts, but we did break into the lunch lines where they had the catering trucks, which was, that was the next best thing. But I remember it was Chris Penn, and they wanted to come up with a catchphrase. Like, they had so many of them in Fast Times. So Chris Penn's catchphrase for The Wildlife was, it's casual.
Oh, yeah.
And it just never stuck.
The thing too, of course, you must have been excited when you heard that Eddie had contributed music to the mission. Like, oh, this is the greatest thing ever at my high school. And then,
it really was. I felt like he did it for me.
Yeah. I just, as a kid, 14, 15-year-old kid, I saw the 1984 tour I know you saw Van Halen, and you should share your stories about seeing Van Halen. I saw them in 1984 tour, but I just remember walking around in the hall the next day at school, had my Van Halen jersey on.
Proud.
And it was just like something changed. And it was like almost like you'd lost your virginity or something. You're like, oh yeah, I've seen something that's the greatest thing I've ever seen in my life. This is it. I mean, this is it. And all these kids who don't know, they're missing out. It was just, it was a game changer for me in so many ways to see that tour and to see Dave on that stage and him standing up there and controlling the crowd. And I remember one of the things he said was like, after the rest of the concert, let's go across the street and get drunk, which I'm sure he said in 85 to 90% of the tour stops they made. But at the time it was like, oh my God, he cursed. It was like just.
Did he mean it?
Yeah.
Did he want us to meet him over there?
Exactly. It just sort of the rawness of it was so loud and so brash. And so all these things that were so, they really were dialed in on Van Halen and what would get into the mind of this 15-year-old kid and all the other 15-year-old kids who were in that audience.
It was a different period. I tell a story on stage just about every night, everybody, and I try to sell it in a way that it's the first time that I tell it each time. And it's a true story. It's the 1981 Fair Warning tour. And it was either the weekend before the famous Oakland recordings, or it was the weekend after. It was obviously LA to Oakland, back and forth, whatever. And I tell the story that, back then, to get Van Halen tickets, they released the ad in the LA Times calendar section full-page Van Halen tickets on sale this Saturday, and everybody's excited about it. And then I had to go to my parents and explain to them that the only way I'm going to be able to get a set of these Van Halen tickets is if I wait all night long at the Sears Ticketron at the mall. So my friends and I would go down. We'd have Nerf footballs, bag of Doritos. We wouldn't tell our parents, but we'd have beers, and we'd wait the whole night. And then the next morning, the window would open up. And you literally had about 7 minutes to get your tickets. Now, everybody was waiting in a nice line that whole evening. But when it came down to it, everybody rushed the window. And, you fought to be one of those first people. And I think that tour, I was maybe the third one to get my tickets. And we were in the Colonnade section, really with our back to the wall at the Great Western Forum. We had possibly the worst tickets in the whole place. And not only did I have the tickets at that point, but then I had to wait 9 months to go to the Van Halen show. Yeah. Whereas today, if I want to go see Van Halen, just hop on my Apple, order up my tickets on StubHub, print them out, and I just go to the show same day. It's a different game.
I should send this. I'll look if I can find and send this to you. I have an article from someone sent to me, or I found from a New Mexico newspaper from the 1984 tour, and it's basically an article about the line. It's like the reporters went out and talked to the kids, how long have you been waiting in line? So it's the day before the ticket went on sale. The reporter was out there, and then, of course, the article ran the day the tickets went on sale for the shows. And, I've been out here for 7 hours, and what they're doing with their friends, and they're sneaking cigarettes, or whatever they were doing. It's just this – it was this totally different approach to the way that people got tickets. And, yeah, you didn't get to choose your seat. There was no, when you were in that line, they were like, best available. That was it. There was no – because there were people were pushing, come on, hurry up, get out of the way.
Yeah, it was,
Brian,
it was a war.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of the things you've written. I in my research, I'm like, well, as much as I want to talk Van Halen the whole time, that's going to be the biggest challenge, is not talking Van Halen the whole hour that we're together. So I was checking out some of the articles that you've written. One of the ones I loved was the one on Pink Floyd at the LA Sports Arena.
Yeah. So one of the things that I did for the 1978, I'm going to segue quickly to Pink Floyd. For the part of the book about Van Halen in 1978, I did a lot of newspaper research, and you end up reading these articles and paging through stuff. And the whole drug bust thing that happened with Pink Floyd, it was really interesting to me that I came across that story, and to realize that when we were kids, we would go to whatever concert we would go to, and as soon as the lights went out, people would start lighting up joints, and there was basically this understanding that, unless you bump into a cop inside the arena, no one's going to come and take your joint away. No one's going to do this to take your booze or whatever, as long as you're sort of keeping it somewhat undercover. But to understand that at the Pink Floyd show, which of course is the height of drug culture, 75 was that show? I think it was 1975 at the Forum, that basically they arrested hundreds of kids and made it so that there was this war on drugs was going to be legit. We're not going to stand back.
We're going to solve it right now and here tonight.
We're not going to stand back and watch this happen. And to recognize that was, I'm not sure I went into that in great detail in the article, but it was ended up being this big political football, because the promoters were basically saying, okay, this is what's going to happen. We can't bring the shows to these arenas anymore. And so think of all the jobs and all the money, and this is a big boost to the economy of Los Angeles. It's the mid-70s. The economy is not doing that well in that part, and so there was this big political football that was kicked around, and they had to be able to sort of find a negotiated settlement between the chief of police, whose name is escaping me, but is sort of notorious for being a real hard ass, and these promoters who had enough, if I remember the story correctly, had enough juice to basically say, yeah, if you think it's better to have the Forum dark and not to be able to employ all the people who work there and have all that money come into the Los Angeles economy.
Sure.
Okay. We'll take the concerts outside. I'll promote concerts outside of LA proper, outside of the jurisdiction of LAPD, and we'll promote concerts there, because the Forum has become this. I think it was the Forum, or the Sports Arena.
Yeah, I think it was the LA Sports Arena.
That it was become this, because you guys have decided to make this unworkable, because you can't have a rock band come in and then have the police dragging kids out and beating kids and dragging kids out by their hair.
So you learned about that whole thing in researching.
Yeah,
Rising.
It was one of those things, because you get these rolls of microfilm and sort of scroll through. And I also, there are databases that you can word search now with the newspaper, which is nice. And so I may have put two words together and not had Van Halen in it for some reason, and it came up, and I was really from remembering what concert culture was like when we were kids, it was sort of unthinkable to me that would ever happen in a concert, that the state police would come in New Jersey. The New Jersey State Police would come in and start just like dragging kids, because they could have. I mean, it was like every row there were law breaking going on, but that would happen. And so I was like, wow, that must have been a very unpleasant night for all the people involved with that.
Wow. Yeah, it makes me think back to that 81 Fair Warning Van Halen concert. See, I'm bringing it back to Van Halen. And I have a picture of me in my Van Halen baseball jersey, shirt that I bought. I had so much money. I was going to buy a program. I was going to buy a hat, and I was going to buy a shirt. And I saw pictures of me the next day. We had a family trip to Disneyland. So I was sporting that Van Halen jersey the next day.
That's great.
And oh my God. Okay, this is what I'm wearing. First of all, the hair is out of control. I don't know what was going on, who was in charge of combing my hair, but that was out of control. But then I've got the Van Halen shirt on, and then I've got OP shorts that are like
the little corduroy shorts,
about that long, like all early 1980s
Classic.
NBA, and then the hang 10 3-stripe socks. See, you're doing it right there. 3-stripe socks all the way up to the knees with my Van slip-ons, and I was like,
it's the greatest. That's LA. That's Southern California right there. That's in a nutshell. That's the greatest thing. I can visualize it all in my head. Yeah. This applies to bands other than Van Halen as well. But one of the stories that I came across for the book, which I couldn't put in the book because it didn't fit in the timeline, but that Eddie became friends with Kenny Richards, the drummer from Autograph, and then Dave was friends with Kenny Richards. So Dave has in 1984
which they opened for them,
right? So Dave is friends with Kenny Richards and the drummer for Autograph, and they end up putting the band on the 84 tour. And so Eddie, I must have gotten the word from the manager, Noel Monk, or from Dave that they were going to have this band. And Eddie meets Kenny Richards. And Eddie says to Kenny, it's good, man. He's like, I'm glad you guys are going to come out with us because we need a t-shirt band. And Kenny's like, what's a t-shirt band? He's like, oh yeah, that's a band that the kids are going to hate. They're really going to suck. And then when you guys are playing, all the kids are going to be in the hall buying merch. And I was like thinking, like, that explains it. When I heard that story,
I guess it does.
For Van Halen, the opening acts were always, my estimation,
you're going to describe
not like, the Fabulous Poodles and some of these other bands. I didn't see them, of course. There was 79, but the bands that wouldn't seem to be very much in sync with the average Van Halen fan. And now I understand the strategy. You put on an opening act, but the idea is to push all the children and the kids out of the arena into the alleys and the aisles around the arena and buy merch. And so he has a t-shirt band, and Kenny Richards told that story in an interview. I thought
that's great. Can I tell you that the Atomic Punks have a better time slot on the Monster Rock cruise that we're getting ready to go on, and it's better than the Autograph, who's also on the cruise?
Yeah.
There you go. Cool. Maybe I should cut that. Maybe that shouldn't be in there. But it's still kind of cool, right?
Yeah. Well, I ended up interviewing Randy from Autograph for the book. He's a great guy. And
they just got back together over the last couple of years, which is really cool that they're back out doing stuff.
Randy and Steve Plunkett were in a band called Wolfgang, and they played club dates with Van Halen. So Randy goes way back with those guys. And you had all your merch, but of course that was the opening act was. I'm sure you were not glued to your seat like I've got to catch the opening act. It was all about Van Halen.
Walking into the Forum and seeing the merch table was like Christmas morning. You walk up and it's all Van Halen, because there was no way. How would you get Van Halen merchandise back then other than actually going to a show?
Yeah.
Nowadays you can pick up anything. It's simple. So talk to me about another article that I read that I loved. Love this one. This was on Eric Clapton and Creem and the review that he read and got upset. I love Creem, and Eddie's one of Eddie's influences too.
So when I was in graduate school, I actually attended a university called Brandeis University. It's in Boston. That's where I did my PhD. I was doing a PhD in American history, and at the time I was going through, I don't know about how you are, but I go through these phases where I listen to these bands continually for like a month at a time. Then I'll swap, and eventually I'll circle back. But I was on this Creem kick and listening to all this Creem music. And I found this website where this this guy had basically the history of Creem on there. And there was a show, they said they had played Brandeis University. And this guy is I believe he was in Sweden, one of the Scandinavian countries. And I emailed him and I said that I'm a history student. And he said, oh, would you go look and see if there's any newspaper articles about it? And so I said, yeah. And he offered to send me some bootlegs, Creem bootlegs. I think that was the attraction for me to the website. He had Creem bootlegs. And so he sent me some of these shows on CD if I would go and pull the microfilm out. And so I ended up pulling out the school newspaper and I pull it out and the date that had been attached to the show was wrong because now I had the school newspaper and I figured out when the show had happened. And what was really, really amazing was I was reading this review and I'm looking at who wrote the review in the Brandeis University School newspaper in 1967. And it's John Landau. And I was like, John Landau, I know that name. And I was like, that's weird. And it's rattling around in my head. And I probably at the time,
which I did the same thing.
Looked around and I was like, oh, John Landau wrote for Rolling Stone. John Landau, who was involved in Springsteen's career, I think still involved in Springsteen's career. I ended up getting a copy of the review in Rolling Stone magazine that Landau wrote around the same time. And I looked at it, I was like, it's the same review. It's basically John Landau wrote it for the student newspaper and then turned around and then edited it down a little bit, changed some things and sent it to Rolling Stone. And they published his review. And then I found out that Clapton had read that exact review in Rolling Stone magazine and had been so upset by Landau basically saying it's just rehashed blues licks, that Creem is overrated, that they're just jamming for the sake of jamming. And that Landau, who was a kid, I was a young kid at the time anyway, but sort of that for whatever reason that really touched a nerve in Clapton and sort of made Clapton realize that what he was doing was going nowhere. He felt musically. There was all these problems in the band anyway with the relationships between Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce. But he had to sort of be able to kind of put all that together and be like, wow, that was the gig. That was the gig at Brandeis University that they played that ends up being reviewed in Rolling Stone magazine. In the Rolling Stone magazine, it doesn't say Brandeis. It just says, I caught, basically, I think the art review says something like, I caught Creem in a Boston area gig. And to sort of be like, wow, this was a historic moment that because this review gets written and then Clapton ends up wanting to quit and start Blind Faith, if I remember correctly, because of his he was just disenchanted with the whole Creem thing. And that really wounded
that's interesting. Him. Such a powerhouse guitar player like that, Well, and I think it's also a good reminder of no matter how successful, how famous you are, people will still have insecurities and still have vulnerabilities. And Landau was able to, I don't think intentionally was trying to, break up Creem. Obviously he wasn't, but he sort of that touched that nerve inside Clapton, and Clapton was like, I can't do this anymore. And he sort of, kind of brought forth what Clapton was probably already thinking, that this is not working long-term and we're not growing musically anymore because we're not getting along in the group. We just don't have this, we have this poison relationships between the three of us. So as a writer, how do you deal with critiques?
Don't read your Amazon reviews.
It's not easy, right?
It is not easy. For the most part, I've had it pretty easy because people have liked the book. And so that's the thing. I look at some other writers who have written, people I respect, Chuck Klosterman and other people. And I look at, that he was reviewed in the New York Times recently. I really like his new book, What If Everything We Know Is Wrong? Or I think that's the title. I'm a big fan of Chuck Klosterman, and I read the New York Times, and the New York Times was not particularly kind to his book. And I was like,
I can imagine being a writer and pouring your life into such a project like that and then having to read something. Sure.
And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that I have not, I don't think, faced the real type of adversity of that where some people have. Of course, there's reviews up on Amazon. People don't like the book or whatever. But for the most part, I've had, like from you, a lot of people who've really appreciated the book and said they've liked it. And so that's something that is great to hear. But yeah, you have to sort of at some point decide to separate out yourself from the book. The book isn't me. I worked hard on this, but hey, it's a book. It's not me. I'm not, whatever they're saying, it's not a personal dagger at me because, 99% of the time anyway, the people don't know you anyway. And so it's just like, you're this disembodied person. I don't like this book. They don't know you. So it's like, don't take it personally, which is hard, which is you have to sort of that mantra. And as a performer yourself, I'm sure you,
it's difficult as a singer, that took some getting used to, because I didn't start singing until real late in life. And that was the hardest part when I first started, because for me doing the Van Halen thing, I was being compared to not only David Lee Roth, but then I was being compared to Ralph Sands, who in music circles is considered, one of the best around, period, of everybody that's doing it. So for me, I felt like a double whammy. And in a lot of ways, I was taking on more critiques towards Ralph. In fact, I read one today. I'm like, wow, it'd been a while. I guess I was due for one. But they all sting. And I think what bothers me, on my end is, wow, you really took the time to write something negative about something that I'm trying to bring pleasure, to people,
Right.
So it's tough.
Yeah, it is difficult not to look at to see that and stuff. And sometimes, you look and, but I just think, when you see the stuff, you have to just say it's coming from whatever place that person's coming from, whatever issue they have. It's, because you didn't nail Atomic Punk to their liking, that's their issue. I mean, it's like, like the other 80 people who were there who would have written reviews if they had been like told to, would have said it was great. You'd have like this one person who bothers and the other people who like it, but not everyone sits down. So
and if you respond to the guy, you basically lose. You've lost.
You don't even go there. I think that's the thing too. It's just sort of, you move on. I mean, the book reviews, like, this is too well, just the things sometimes you're like, I did the best I could. And that's what you try to say to yourself too. I'm sure you walked off stage and say, I did the best I could. It wasn't like I went up there and tried to mail it in, or, I'm doing the best I can to sing. And if you don't like it, well, that's your problem ultimately. Sorry, I did my best. I was trying to please you. It wasn't like I'm up there singing, trying to,
not trying to suck.
Yeah, no, right. And so for you as a singer, it's probably, I don't know, maybe even more, I would imagine even more painful, because it's sort of, it's just, I don't know. Yeah, like you said, you have this sort of already have a model up there. It isn't as if people in my, in the circles who are reading my book were basically saying, you're not as good as Hemingway and, Shakespeare. This isn't, you have Shakespeare, you're going to be measured, whether you like it or not, against the original.
Right. And I think the bottom line, anything you do that's in the public eye, that's one of the things you have to deal with. I think at first I felt like, well, God, there's not like I'm going to have some random guy write a review about, how I'm doing at my regular day job, Monday through Friday.
Exactly.
It's like,
exactly.
Gosh.
Exactly. You blew the coffee this morning, Brian. I mean, making the coffee, it was way too bitter.
Exactly.
It's like,
what are you thinking?
Yeah, it's awful. The good thing about social media, of course, is it helps you connect with people and lets people who are excited or enthusiastic about something you're doing.
Do you think that helped? Do you think that helped the book?
Oh yeah, I think it did help it a lot. I think that being able to network with fans, just as a fan myself, I'm sure you've experienced this with your band, that it gets people to know that you're invested in it, and that I'm not just going on Facebook or Twitter because I feel like I better go on Twitter today to talk about Van Halen. It's like, I'm going on Twitter because I like to talk about Van Halen, and it happens to be I wrote this book. And hey, if you're a fan, check out the book. You might like it. So, yeah.
So what's the one thing that didn't make the book that you wish would have been in the book?
Okay, I'll tell a story, and I can tell the story in the way that's appropriate for listening here. Is that there was a woman, or is a woman, who I was told that was able to wrangle an agreement with Van Halen that she was to, if the band was to be hired, that basically she was going to have to get to have some quiet time with David Lee Roth away from the rest of the.
Is that right?
And that's the story. And I am very confident it's true. This individual, she's decided that she didn't want to speak to me sort of the last second. It was all set up. I was going to talk to her. But I would have thought that would have been one of the greatest backyard party stories of all time. Like basically, I have the choice between bands I can hire. I can hire this band. I can hire this band. And I've got this money. I can pay you guys. But the only way I'll hire you is if I get to spend time alone with Dave. And I'm sure Dave was like, oh, God, twist my arm, or whatever. I have to do this.
Well, I did a private party down in San Diego the other night. They didn't talk anything about that.
There was no added attractions. But that was the story that I had heard. That I heard it secondhand. But it was not a story I felt comfortable repeating second. If she had told it, I probably would have put it in the book. But yes, that was one that I thought was right up there with one of the better ones that was in the book.
That's great. So this is the part of the show where I'm going to throw out a few questions for you.
Okay.
And you can, of course, answer them any way you like. top 3 desert island albums. Okay. You're stranded on an island and then you have a turntable and there's power, but only enough power to run your 1978 record player. Which 3 albums would they be? Now, a couple stipulations here. No greatest hits albums. And I'm going to make you work for it, Greg. No Van Halen albums.
Okay. I'm ready. Desert Island, number 1, Band of Gypsies, Jimi Hendrix.
I knew there was some Hendrix coming. I'm a big Jimi Hendrix fan. I'm not the biggest fan of his early psychedelic pop stuff, like the Are You Experienced? That's not a record that I pull out regularly and listen to. But Band of Gypsies, just the heaviness of it. Especially, I was a guitar player who never really got past the intermediate stage. As a guitar player, Hendrix always captured my imagination the way he would put together these long parts, like on Machine Gun and some of these other songs where these jams would just go on these bluesy jams. And so that's definitely one that is up there. I'll do maybe a little bit more of an obvious one. I'll do Led Zeppelin 4 today. Okay.
As a kid,
were you introduced to Led Zeppelin with the Led Zeppelin 4 album?
That was the first one I heard, and I heard it around 5th grade. And that was sort of before, so I was like 10, 11 years old. It was before I came into being a big fan of rock music. But this is a classic. This is something that should be in the next. If they ever make a Van Halen Rising movie, they should put this in the movie. We had a school bus driver who, for whatever reason, had convinced the township school bus authority to let her put a tape deck, and she had mounted these speakers in the school bus. So I swear this is true. And so she would play. This is probably like 81. So it's probably 6th grade, 7th grade, 5th grade, something there. Probably, I say 1981 or so. It would be, she played Jay Giles' band, or she'd play Foreigner 4. But I remember one of the things she would play was Led Zeppelin 4. And I'm not sure, I knew it was, eventually I figured out it was Led Zeppelin. I'm not sure I knew it was Led Zeppelin 4, but I can sort of remember riding the school bus with
the
rock
Battle
and roll.
of Evermore playing.
It's 100% true. It's 100% true. And I will tell you the punchline to this story, which is really a funny story. Now, it's a funny retrospect, is that she was clearly very relaxed when she was driving the bus. I don't think I knew that at 5th, 6th grade, but she was clearly like in her mellow zone, if you know what I mean, driving the bus. She came to work stoned, and she ended up being dismissed from her job at some point. My little brother was on the bus, and she was like all over the road, and
wow.
It was apparently a fairly scary thing. And then the story goes, and the bus would drive from the high school to the first stop in the neighborhood, wherever it was, and every single kid on the bus got off on the first stop.
Oh my God.
They were like 4 miles from home. They were like, exactly. Everyone got off the bus. Every kid got off the bus because they were scared for their life. But that was, I would like to thank that woman for that, because that was a fun introduction. It was very loud. She would play it loud, and I don't know, no one. I mean, there were no parents on the bus, and as far as I know, no one ever complained. It was just a fun thing. It made the ride home from school a lot of fun. Billy Squier, Don't Say No. That's the type of stuff she was playing on the bus. These tapes she would play. So yes, Led Zeppelin 4. Awesome. That was one. Okay, so nothing before 1978. Let's go back to first Cactus record. We talked about that a little bit. Yeah, we'll do that one.
That's the second time we brought up Cactus. I'm going to have to do a revisit.
Because that's my stealth way of saying that I'm listening to Van Halen, because that album has a song on it called Let Me Swim, which famously on some of the Starwood bootleg, Van Halen plays a song called Let Me Swim, which is actually a Cactus song. In addition, if you listen to Let Me Swim on the Cactus record, there is a introduction to that song that starts with a drum roll, a guitar chord, a little guitar lick from the guitar player from Cactus, and then a bump, bump, bum, another guitar lick, which is basically the introduction to Eruption. That's where Eddie and Alex copped that from. So you're actually getting a little bit of flavor of Van Halen.
Interesting.
Third thing, as I mentioned to you before we came on, the Parchment Farm song, which is this fast boogie shuffle, which without a doubt was the blueprint for Eddie and Alex to do I'm the One and some of the other stuff, that Full Bug and all that. That was sort of their beginning of, how do we take rock music to a different level of intensity? And Cactus was one of those groups that they got into. They were into Captain Beyond and Black Sabbath, and they were into Grand Funk, as we know. But Cactus is sort of the secret sauce for me when it comes to kind of creating the Van Halen that I love so much.
Great picks. All right. Favorite TV show growing up?
Oh my gosh. Okay. How about we'll do Night Flight. It was on, I think, USA Network. Night Flight was one of these rock video shows. There was one called Radio 1990. There was Night Flight. The show itself, as I recall, maybe had a couple of interviews. They'd have, we're going to have Pat Benatar on, and they had like a segment with
kind of like a Don Kirshner's rock concert.
Yeah, right. But they had also, I think they would have like these little interview clips. But I sort of knew from my own, that early 80s period of time, that if you really wanted to start to see some of the weirder Van Halen videos, because again, there was no way to see these videos unless your friend taped them. Sometimes you'd be like, oh, I taped Dance the Night Away or Unchained. And I remember I ended up with a video. I would stay up and watch the show. I don't remember if it was on every night or probably once a week it was on, but I would stay up with my finger on the VCR button waiting, especially if they said like Van Halen's going to play, the VCR, whatever. I always remember there was like a lag. Like you always had to like, we was afraid if you were going to start it too late. You
probably still have that VHS
I do have
tape
it somewhere. I've watched it, but
right?
yes. And so it's exactly in a box somewhere. But so, Dance the Night Away and Unchained, I ended up getting those on tape. And so that for me was a show that I really, really loved as a kid. There was another, I said Radio 1990 was another one, but just you knew as a rock fan, you weren't going to see, most likely, especially as MTV became much more of just a bigger part of American culture. You weren't going to see some, Molly Hatchet early promo film from 1979 at 4:00 in the afternoon on MTV. But if you stayed up till midnight, there was a chance they were going to play this, the sort of the more obscure stuff. And so that was the big thing for me, was sort of as I became, more and more into rock music, I wanted to kind of catch oh wow, look, they're playing Jimi Hendrix Wild Thing at Monterey Pop. They'd play this video of that, and you're like, oh my gosh, because you weren't going to see that on MTV probably.
Right. Okay, Greg, I have one question. It is the most important question of the afternoon, my friend. Circus magazine or Creem magazine?
That's a great question. I was a Circus guy. I got to say, I know that the hip and the cool and the ironic writing was all inside Creem, but I was definitely somebody who read a lot of Circus magazine. I had, unfortunately, don't think a picture of this exists, but I had this bedroom wall which had cutting out all the different pictures of all the guitar players on the wall. And for me, I think that was probably the driver for me, was the pictures. I read the articles, but I really liked I read Creem magazine for the pictures, Circus magazine for the pictures. And so, that was
That's a good way to look at it,
big driver. Now there was a couple of this, the special editions would come out, like Creem heavy metal. I will say one thing that's really humorous to me in retrospect in working through Creem magazine and working on the Van Halen book. One thing that was very entertaining was to realize that Creem magazine thought Van Halen sucked in 1978. When you read the reviews, there's this review that was done of a New York City show when Van Halen first hits the scene in April of 78, where the writer is basically mocking Van Halen.
Is that right?
Sort of like tongue in cheek, like, well, it's Jim Dandy with rehashed Deep Purple, basically, just sort of like making fun of this, like punk rock as the new big thing. This is old. This is just. This is done. This is all played out.
Creem magazine was kind of a darker version.
Yeah. And so Creem magazine was really invested in getting invested in new wave and Sex Pistols and this sort of stuff was a little bit more up there, like the Ramones, particularly that type of stuff.
And they're doing they're actually doing a documentary. I've talked to a couple of the guys, and they've been trying to pull together the finances to do a rockumentary on Creem magazine, which is going to be great. I've actually talked to the guys, and eventually I'm going to have them on the show to talk about it. I think that's just an interesting, great genre that we both had growing up. I mean, I lived for both those magazines.
Yeah, the thing too about Creem magazine, and then by 1980, it's almost like Van Halen won them over. Like the publishers or the editors were like, Van Halen, people like them, we'll like them, whatever. They sort of changed their tune. And there's that great article that comes out in 1980. If you hate Van Halen, you're wrong. That's the title of the article. And the guy went on the road with Van Halen and did this whole thing. And so, for me, it was all about Circus magazine.
Greg, this has been a blast. I've enjoyed it. I've been looking forward to this interview. Where can everybody learn about you and find out what the latest happenings are in your world?
Yeah, I think probably the best way to get in touch with me is Twitter at Greg Renoff. Also on Facebook /Van Halen Rising. I would love if people gave me a like there. And through my website, which is vanhalenrising.com, you can certainly send me an email through there. And I reply to every email I get If I don't, write me again because I've actually made a mistake not replying to you. So I just appreciate it so much. Thank you so much for the time.
Yeah, really appreciate it, Greg. Thanks for coming in. And I think we need to definitely do this again.
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you so much, Brian.
Was that amazing or what? If you're a Van Halen or just a music fan, that's what it's all about. I'm always down for talking VH, but then you throw in a crazy school bus driver story to go along with Rolling Stone, Circus, and Creem magazines. Well, I'm in. Make sure and keep an eye out for some of Greg's work too. He's working on an amazing new project that I am sworn to secrecy on, so be on the lookout. This week's Artist Spotlight is a good one. The band is called Unlocking the Truth, and get this, they're 3 teenage boys from Brooklyn, New York. Kids like this give us old guys hope that rock and roll will always be strong. So let me run down some stats on these kids. They've performed Amateur Night at Harlem's Apollo Theater. They're the youngest group ever to perform at Coachella. They've played Bonnaroo and supported the likes of Queens of the Stone Age, Living Colour, Guns N' Roses, Motorhead, and Marilyn Manson. So give these guys some love. This song is called Made of Stone, and it's off their album Chaos. Enjoy.
You become so quiet. Is there anybody home? And I become a riot, and I don't wanna die alone. And your words so silent, had your heart turned to stone. And I become so violent. This place is not a home.
Cover Your Ears is brought to you by Ultimate Ears Pro, setting the standard for custom in-ear monitors for more than 20 years. Ultimate Ears Pro is dedicated to delivering the ultimate sound experience. To learn more, visit pro.ultimateears.com. Every guest on Cover Your Ears receives a set of Ultimate Ears UE900s. When you want the sound of a custom in-ear monitor with the convenience of a universal fit system. You can find the Atomic Punks, the tribute to classic Van Halen, at www.theatomicpunks.com, or check us out on Facebook or Twitter, where you can see pictures, videos, our schedule, and of course, booking information. Check for brand new episodes of Cover Your Ears each and every Tuesday. Send me some feedback too, good or bad. You can contact me with any comments, suggestions, or questions at briangellervo@gmail.com. And if you like the podcast, please make sure and leave a review wherever you may have found Cover Your Ears. And do a guy a favor, tell a friend. Oh, and if you have something interesting to say and you're in the business, let me know. It could make for a fun show. We'll see you next week.